100 years ago, in 1912, and in the whole decade of the 1920s, up in 1923, hundreds of Jews arrived on the docks of New York every day. In fact, between 1891, when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in the streets of St. Petersburg, until 1923, when the United States adopted the immigration quota law, 1,800,000 Jews, and possibly even more, arrived in this country. The exact number isn't known because there were no immigration laws, and so people were not counted. The reason they left in 1891 is because Alexander III blamed the Jews for the assassination of his father and terrific persecutions of the Russian Jewish population occurred. By Russian Jews would be meant all those living in the Russian Empire, and that included all of Poland, the Balkans, and the Baltic states. There were about 11 million Jews in Europe at the time, and of those, over 9 million lived in the Russian Empire. In any event, one day, on a Saturday, on a beautiful day in June, one of the Russian Jews met his brother, who'd been in New York for some time, at the dock. He had just come off the boat, and he was wearing the usual garb of the Orthodox Eastern European Jews. He had a black hat and payas and tzitzis and a black coat, and so did his brother. They hugged, they kissed, they were so happy to see each other. And the American brother, already here 6 months, said, well, look, it's a great day in June, but it's Shabbos, and that being the case, we can't ride, so what we'll do is we'll walk to my apartment. Well, they walked to his apartment, and as they came to a little park in the middle of Manhattan, a park in the round, they saw a number of people sitting on benches. In front of them were little wrought iron tables, and people had put their lunch on there. Now, one fellow sitting there was wearing a rust-colored trousers, and he had a Hawaiian shirt hanging over his belt. He was bald-headed, he didn't have a hat on. He was smoking a cigar, and on the table in front of him was a ham sandwich and a carton of milk. So every so often he'd lay down the cigar and pick up the ham sandwich, and then in his left hand he had a Yiddish newspaper, was reading that, and he'd read that, put down the sandwich. The newcomer said to his brother, my goodness, are we Jews lucky to be in the United States? It's just wonderful here for us Jews. His brother said, what are you talking about? You've been here 10 minutes, how do you know that? He said, well, look, you see that fellow with the rust-colored trousers and the Hawaiian shirt, smoking a cigar, eating a ham sandwich, and he's reading a Yiddish newspaper? That shows you that in the United States, even the Goyim read Yiddish. Now, that seems like a joke, but in a way it's not a joke, because the Russian Jews who came were a tiny minority of all the Jews of Europe. And one of the questions we have legitimately ought to ask ourselves is, why did they all come? The persecution was horrendous. Admittedly, no one could have foreseen that eventually Hitler would come. However, the Jews were treated so abominably in the Russian Empire. There were the boys were drafted into the Russian army for 20 years and pressured to become Christians. There were pogroms, houses burnt down. Anybody who saw Fiddler on the Roof has some notion of what happened. So the question we have to ask is, when the United States was wide open, why didn't everybody come? Well, the reason was that the rabbis told the population, the Jewish population, you mustn't come to the United States. It's a treyfene medina. This is a Hebrew phrase meaning a torn community. But the implication is it's a community where Jews smoke on Shabbos, eat ham sandwiches, don't pay attention to the religion, marry non-Jews. In other words, leave the Judaism of Europe. And so the rabbis actually taught that it is better to be persecuted in Russia than to come to a free country. This is, in retrospect, a nightmare. Again, admittedly, no one could have known Hitler would come. But just think, if the Russian Jews had taken advantage of the opportunity to come to the United States, 6 million wouldn't have been murdered. Now that raises yet a second question. The second question is, why did they go to Israel? Well, when you think about it, Israel doesn't exist. Did not exist in the 1890s. As we all know, it was founded in 1948. Now, there were some Jews who did, in fact, travel and live in the Holy Land, as it was then called, but that was part of the Turkish Empire. The reason it was part of the Turkish Empire is that in 1453, the Turks had overrun Constantinople, and that, of course, was the capital of what was called the Byzantine Empire, namely the eastern part of what was once the Roman Empire. It was called Byzantium or Byzantine because when the Emperor Constantine in 453 moved the capital of the empire from Rome to a small town in what is now Turkey. This small town was called Byzantium, and he called it the city of Constantinople. Well, that lasted from the 5th century till 1453. The Turks overran it and seized all of what we now call the Middle East. And so the Holy Land was in the Turkish Empire. Now, the Sultan was in no mood to allow all kinds of Jews to establish any kind of a state there, but individual Jews had moved in on occasion. The main reason also why so many Jews remained in Europe and wouldn't go into the Holy Land is because the rabbis taught that you can't really establish a Jewish nation in the Holy Land until the Messiah comes. Now, granted, the Sultan of Turkey wasn't going to let that happen anyway. But what is particularly of interest is that most of us imagine or believe, from what we've been told, that Zionism as we know it today, that finally succeeded in 1948, was, in a sense, the invention of Theodor Herzl and his followers. The fact of the matter is that Zionism is a lot older than that, and that the first Zionists were not Jews. The first Zionists were British Protestants. That must come as a tremendous surprise to us. But here are the facts. In 1532, a man by the name of Tinsdale, William Tinsdale, who had been granted a master's degree in languages at Oxford University, translated the Torah from the Hebrew into English. Now, Tinsdale was a Catholic. There was no other Christianity in England other than Catholicism. So he did something that was strictly prohibited by the Catholic Church. They did not want the Bible to be translated into English because Martin Luther had already translated the Bible into German, resulting in the Protestant Reformation. And of course the church was afraid that if this happened in England, they would walk out also. Now the fact is that before Tinsdale, 100 years before Tinsdale, the Bible had actually been translated not from the Hebrew into English, but from the Latin into English. The fellow who did this, one man by the name of Wycliffe, the church was so angry about this, they literally exhumed his dead body, burnt it, and threw the ashes into a river. So it was obvious that anybody who did this was in serious trouble. They promised the death penalty for translating the Bible into English. Well, Tinsdale obviously couldn't get it published in England. 2 years after he did this, that's 1534, Henry VIII in Parliament renounced allegiance to the Pope and made Henry the head of the church. This was the founding of the Anglican Church. But Henry VIII was not willing to let the Bible be published in English either. So Tinsdale went to Germany, and he lived with Luther in Wittenberg. Wittenberg was Protestant. The king of Wittenberg protected Luther and also protected Tinsdale. But Tinsdale made a big mistake. One day he heard that one of his friends was seriously ill in Belgium. So he went to Belgium to see his friend. Well, Belgium was an entirely Catholic country. The Inquisition found out that he was there. He was seized and murdered. He was burnt at the stake in public. And it would look as though that would be the end of any translation of the Torah into English. However, after Henry VIII died, his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, inherited the throne. And when she died in 1603, Parliament voted and elected a king, the King of Scotland, James VI, and made him James I of England. James I was a Protestant. He moved into London, and he moved into a palace which had a large yard, and because he was Scottish, people called it Scotland Yard. It was later used by the London police, and to this day, even though the police in London doesn't use that building anymore, the London police is still called Scotland Yard. Aside from this, William now, or rather James, now allowed the Bible to be published in English. In fact, he appointed 26 scholars to do the translation over again, but the 26 scholars, having looked over Tinsdale's manuscript, pretty much published what Tinsdale had done, and so they published the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, now in English, and it is called to this day the King James Version of the Bible, because King James allowed this. Now that is what set off Zionism, because one has to understand that there was no internet, there was no television, there was no radio, there were no newspapers, there were no magazines, there was nothing to read except the Bible. And for once it was in English. So Englishmen throughout read the Bible, and they became very much interested in the 5 books of Moses. In fact, they wanted to see the reestablishment of the ancient Israelite kingdom in the Holy Land. So they pressured the English government to talk to the Sultan of Turkey and allow the Jews from Europe to come back into the Holy Land. Well, the Sultan wouldn't have any of it. However, the Bible was so popular, the English Bible, that much later, in 1917, the then Prime Minister of England, David Lloyd George, spoke to a Jewish audience, and he said, "I can't recite the kings of England, but I can recite every king of Israel, because that's how seriously we took the Bible." So throughout all those years, from 1603 on, the pressure was on to get the Sultan of Turkey to allow the Jews to return, but this was not done. He wouldn't do it. Nobody would do it. But in 1914, the First World War broke out. And in the First World War, Germany, Austria, and Turkey were allied. So when the Central Powers, as they were called, lost the First World War, and Turkey was on the losing end, the British occupied what was then called the Holy Land. General Allenby of England defeated the Turks at the Battle of Acre and marched into Jerusalem. And so for the first time in all those hundreds of years, the British finally occupied the Holy Land. This was the opportunity to finally make it possible for the British to allow the Jews to return to their ancient land and establish a Jewish nation. As everybody knows, the Foreign Secretary in the British government, Lord Arthur Balfour, issued the famous Balfour Declaration. And so the British literally invited the European Jews to come to Israel. They wouldn't come. Once more, the rabbis said, no, you can't establish a state in the Holy Land, a Jewish state, because it can only be done when Messiah comes. The Moshiach must come. Well, the Moshiach didn't come, Hitler came. Now, again, they couldn't have known Hitler would come, but they did know that the position of the Jews in Russia and all over Europe was, to put it mildly, precarious. But on those grounds, they wouldn't come. Let us take it even further. In 1919, there was a peace conference in Versailles, which is a suburb of Paris. The Allies were represented, and so was Germany, Austria, and Turkey. One of the observers who came to the peace conference in 1919 in Versailles was the only ruling Arab king at that time. All Arab countries, as we know them today, were colonies of England or France. But Iraq had a king. His name was Faisal. Faisal came to the conference, and there he met the then president of the World Zionist Organization, Chaim Weizmann. Faisal and Weizmann signed an agreement to the effect that Faisal and the Arabs welcomed the European Jews to come into the Holy Land and redevelop it, because it was a desert, was hardly anybody living there. This is probably astonishing to people, considering the attitude of the Arabs since then. But here again, the Jews were invited to come, and they would not come. The Mashiach had to come first. So what do we see here? They wouldn't come to the United States because of treyfene and medina. They wouldn't come to the Holy Land because the Mashiach hadn't come, and they were willing to be persecuted. Again, no, they couldn't have known Hitler would come. But nevertheless, why didn't the Jews ever learn anything from their evil experiences? When we look at this today, in 2012, we ask the same question. Do we ever learn anything? We're faced with a United States government who's hostile to Israel, hostile to Israel's survival. Once more, 6 million Jews in Israel are faced with an overwhelming Arab superiority on all their borders, and are to some extent dependent on American help. Yet we have the Democrat Party, of whom only 30%, and you can see it on the Gallup poll, only 30% are willing to support the survival of Israel, while the Republican Party, 68% are willing to support the survival of Israel. Yet the Jews vote for their enemies. This is almost unbelievable. And so we say in retrospect that the German historian of the 19th century used to say, all we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. This, the historian was Leopold von Ranke. It is also attributed to others like George Santayana, but whoever said it, that's the crux of Jewish history. We never learn anything from history. So therefore we hope that maybe for once, just once, finally, in the 21st century, we will look back on our history and see what happens when we're blind to our own advantages. That's the lesson that we learn from the experience of the European Jews.